She did not know his name. She did not know his rank. She did not know that the quiet stranger across the table that night commanded thousands of men, or that the truth she was about to confess, without flattery, without calculation, with nothing left to lose, would do something no battlefield ever had. It would make a general who had stopped looking for anything stop and look and never look away again. It started with nothing more than a storm, a crowded inn, and one empty chair. The rain had not stopped since noon, and by the time the coach rattled to a halt outside the Crown and Thistle, every room above stairs had already been claimed by travelers fleeing the same storm, their voices rising in the common room in a tangle of complaint and relief. Linnet Marsh stood dripping in the doorway, her trunk too heavy to carry farther without help she could not afford to summon, her coin purse too thin to argue with the innkeeper's apologetic shrug as he explained, not unkindly, that there was simply nowhere left to put her. The fire at the far end of the room looked impossibly warm from where she stood, and for a moment she considered whether dignity was worth preserving when one's stockings were soaked through to the bone. There was only one table left with an empty chair, tucked near the window where the candlelight struggled hardest against the gloom outside, and at it sat a man she had never seen before in her life. His coat was plain, well-made but unremarkable, the kind a prosperous steward or a traveling merchant might wear without drawing a second glance. His boots were worn from distance rather than fashion, the leather creased in a way that spoke of long roads rather than long evenings at cards. His eyes lifted to hers with no particular interest at all, neither welcoming nor unwelcoming, simply registering her presence the way one might register the weather changing outside a window. He did not rise with the practiced flourish of a gentleman certain of his own consequence, the kind of performance Linnet had grown weary of expecting from men who wanted something in return for their courtesy. He simply moved his satchel aside on the bench, nodded toward the empty chair across from him, and returned his attention to the bread in front of him as though her arrival were the most ordinary thing in the world, requiring no fuss and no comment. Linnet hesitated only a moment before sitting, grateful for warmth more than company, and grateful, too, that he asked her nothing beyond whether she preferred the stew or the pie, as though her name and her circumstances were matters entirely beside the point. She told him her name was Linnet, nothing more, and he answered in kind. Hollis, he said, as if the single word were the whole of his history, and required no further explanation. Neither offered a surname, neither seemed to expect one. And in that small omission, without either of them intending it, the evening already began to feel unlike any other she had spent among strangers, stripped of the usual calculations that came with introductions among people who cared a great deal about who one's family was and what one's family was worth. Hollis ate without hurry, the way a man eats when he has learned through hard experience that meals are not guaranteed and therefore not to be wasted on conversation he does not want, each bite deliberate, unrushed, as though the storm outside could rage for a week and find him entirely unbothered by the delay. Linnet found herself watching him in brief, unguarded glances over the rim of her cup, cataloging small details the way she might study a stranger she expected to forget by morning. The stillness in his hands when they were not occupied, the way his gaze moved once toward the door each time it opened on a gust of wind and rain, assessing rather than fearing, the posture of a man accustomed to knowing the exits of every room he entered. She decided without much evidence beyond his quiet competence that he was a merchant, perhaps a steward for some estate too far north to matter to anyone she knew, a man whose work had taught him patience and little else, and the thought settled comfortably enough that she did not trouble herself to question it further. He asked her, eventually, in a tone so unremarkable that she almost missed the question entirely, where she was traveling, and she answered honestly because the question carried no weight behind it, No calculation of her worth or her family's standing. None of the careful social arithmetic she had grown used to performing every time a stranger inquired after her circumstances. She was going to her aunt's house in the next county, she told him, because her father's health had failed in the past year, and the rents could no longer be collected without someone present to insist upon them, someone with enough resolve to stand in a tenant's doorway and refuse to leave until the matter was settled. Hollis listened without offering pity, without the soft murmur of condolence she had come to dread from acquaintances who wanted to seem kind without troubling themselves to actually be useful. And she found, to her own quiet surprise, that his silence was easier to bear than sympathy would have been. He offered no story of his own in return. Not yet. And she did not press him for one, sensing instinctively that to ask would be to violate some unspoken understanding that had settled over the table, like the steam rising from their bowls. There was a kind of mercy in his restraint, an unspoken agreement that neither of them owed the other an explanation for why they sat alone, in a storm, at a table meant for travelers with nowhere better to be, and no one waiting up for them with questions. It was, Linnet thought, as she finally allowed herself to relax into the hard wooden chair. The first conversation she could remember having in months that asked nothing of her beyond her honest presence, and she found she did not want it to end simply because the meal eventually would. If stories like this one, quiet, honest, the kind that find you when you least expect them, are the ones that stay with you, take a moment now to subscribe. There are more waiting, and you won't want to miss where this one goes. It was the wine, perhaps, or the bone-deep exhaustion of a day spent arguing with coachmen who would not lower their fares and creditors who would not raise their patience. But somewhere between the second course and the slow dying of the fire across the room, Linnet began to speak more than she had intended, the words slipping loose before she had properly decided to release them. She told him of her father's illness, the slow erosion of a man who had once been unshakable in his certainties, now reduced to asking the same question 3 times within a single hour, and growing distressed when no one answered him gently enough. She told him, too, of the brother who had left for the colonies with promises of frequent letters and had since gone silent for the better part of a year, and of the suitor who had withdrawn his interest the very week her family's fortune became uncertain, as though affection had only ever been a transaction conducted in good economic faith. Hollis did not interrupt, and he did not flinch at the bitterness that crept into her voice when she spoke of the suitor's quiet, cowardly retreat. He only asked, after a pause long enough to feel deliberate, whether she had loved him, and Linnet found herself answering with a truth she had not admitted even to her aunt in the privacy of their shared correspondence, that she had not really, but that the rejection had wounded her all the same, because it confirmed something she had long suspected about her own worth in other people's eyes, a suspicion she had spent years trying not to examine too closely for fear of what she might find. The admission left her feeling strangely exposed, as though she had handed him something fragile without first checking whether his hands were steady enough to hold it. She caught herself then, embarrassed by how much she had given away to a man whose surname she did not know, and whose face she would likely never see again after tonight, and made to apologize for burdening him with troubles that were, after all, entirely her own to carry. But there was something in the way he watched her across the narrow table. Not with judgment, not with the practiced sympathy of a man merely waiting his turn to speak of himself, but with a stillness that suggested he was actually listening, weighing her words rather than simply enduring them. That made the apology die unspoken on her tongue. He simply said, in that same unhurried voice, that her troubles were not a burden, and that surprised her more than anything else he might have said that evening, more than any compliment or reassurance she might have expected from a stranger trying to be kind. It was the question he asked next that undid her composure entirely, catching her so thoroughly off guard that she set down her cup before she could spill it. He asked what she wanted, Not what duty required of her, not what her family expected of her, not what would make her aunt comfortable or her father proud, but what she herself wanted, as though the distinction between obligation and desire had not properly occurred to her in years. Perhaps not since she was a girl young enough to still believe the two might someday align. Linnet sat with the question longer than she meant to, turning it over the way one turns over a stone to see what lives beneath it. And when she finally answered, her voice was quieter than she intended it to be, almost lost beneath the crackle of the dying fire. She confessed that she wanted more than marriage, more than security, more than the relief of watching her family's debts finally settle, to be seen as something other than useful, not as a daughter who managed accounts and negotiated with tenants, not as a niece who would inherit obligation before she ever inherited affection, but as a woman whose presence in a room meant something beyond the practical service she could render to the people around her. She confessed that she had stopped expecting it, because hoping for it had only ever led to disappointment. And disappointment, she had learned through long and bitter practice, was easier to survive when one stopped expecting anything at all worth losing. The words surprised her even as she spoke them, raw in a way she had not allowed herself to be in years, not even in the quiet of her own bedroom where no one could overhear her. She watched Hollis's face for the polite discomfort she expected, the faint recoil men so often gave women who said too much, who admitted to wanting things beyond their station or their duty. But it did not come. Instead, something in his expression shifted, subtle and unguarded in a way that seemed almost involuntary, as though she had said something he had been waiting a long time to hear without knowing he was waiting for it, though neither of them yet understood why a stranger's confession at a rain-soaked inn should land with such unexpected weight. Hollis did not speak for a long moment after she finished, and the silence that followed was not the awkward kind that usually settled over a table when someone had said too much, and both parties scrambled for a way to retreat gracefully. Linnet had braced herself for it to be awkward, for him to change the subject, to retreat into the comfortable safety of small talk about the weather, or the state of the roads, or whether the rain might clear by morning. Instead, he simply looked at her with an attention so complete, so entirely undivided, that she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely visible in a way that had nothing to do with how she looked, and everything to do with who she was. When he finally spoke, it was not to offer comfort or advice in the brisk, well-meaning way people often did when they wanted a difficult conversation to end quickly, but to tell her, simply and without embellishment, that what she wanted was not unreasonable, and that the people who had made her believe otherwise had been wrong about her. Plainly and completely wrong. He said it without flourish, without the practiced charm of a man trying to win her favor or earn her gratitude, and that very plainness was what made her believe him entirely, more than any eloquent speech could have managed. Linnet felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was clenched so tightly, a knot she had been carrying for so long that its absence felt almost like dizziness. She did not yet know that the man across the table had spent the better part of a decade being seen for nothing but his rank, his orders, his usefulness to men who outranked him further still, men who valued his judgment in matters of war and dismissed his judgment in nearly everything else. That her confession had landed on ground far more fertile than she could have possibly guessed from the plainness of his coat and the quiet of his manner. But even without knowing why, she sensed that something had shifted in the air between them, something that would not simply end when the storm did, and the roads cleared for travel in the morning. Something that already felt, against all reason and all evidence, like the beginning of a story rather than a single chance encounter destined to be forgotten by sunrise. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed her confession, one that Hollis found himself reluctant to disturb. Even as the innkeeper began snuffing the candles along the far wall, and the last of the other travelers shuffled off toward whatever beds they had managed to secure. He had spent the better part of his career learning to read rooms quickly, to assess threat and opportunity in the space of a glance. And yet here he was, lingering over a half-finished cup of wine, simply because he did not want the evening to end, a feeling so unfamiliar to him that he almost did not recognize it for what it was. He had dined with generals and ministers, with men whose favor could make or break a career, and none of those conversations had ever left him feeling the way this one did, stripped down to something honest in a way that official dinners never allowed. He found himself asking her questions he had no practical need to ask. What flowers grew in her aunt's garden, whether she preferred the company of dogs or cats, what she read when she had an hour entirely to herself. Small, unimportant questions that nonetheless seemed to matter enormously in the moment, because each answer revealed another small piece of a woman who spoke without performing, without the careful self-editing he had grown so accustomed to in every other conversation of his adult life. Linnet answered each question with the same unguarded honesty she had shown all evening, occasionally laughing at her own answers in a way that suggested she had forgotten, for the moment, to be careful about what she revealed. When the innkeeper finally approached to inform them, with evident reluctance, that the fire would need to be banked for the night, Hollis felt something close to disappointment settle over him, a reluctance to let the evening conclude that he could not entirely explain even to himself. He told himself it was simply the pleasant novelty of conversation unburdened by rank or expectation, nothing more significant than that. But some quieter part of him already suspected the lie in that explanation, even as he rose from the table and reached for his coat. It was the innkeeper who nearly gave him away, though Linnet was too tired and too distracted by the late hour to notice the significance of what passed between the two men. As Hollis settled his account for the evening, the innkeeper's manner shifted subtly, his voice dropping into a register of deference that seemed entirely disproportionate to the modest sum being paid, and he addressed Hollis with a careful formality that did not match the plain coat and unremarkable bearing of the man standing before him. Linnet, gathering her shawl and her thoughts, registered the change only as a vague impression, a feeling that something had passed between the two men that she wasn't meant to fully understand. There was, too, the matter of the ring Hollis wore on his right hand, plain enough in design that she had not given it particular thought during dinner, but which caught the candlelight as he reached for his satchel in a way that revealed, briefly, an engraving she could not quite make out. A crest, perhaps, or some mark of distinction that seemed at odds with the modesty of everything else about him. She told herself it was likely a family heirloom, the sort of thing a man might wear without any particular significance attached to it, and dismissed the thought as quickly as it had arrived, too exhausted by the day's travel to give it the scrutiny it perhaps deserved. What she did notice, and could not quite dismiss, was the way Hollis carried himself as he crossed the room toward the stairs. Not with arrogance, but with a kind of settled authority that seemed to part the remaining crowd, without his appearing to notice he was doing it. Men stepping aside instinctively, in a manner that struck her as curious for a steward or a merchant. She filed the observation away without examining it too closely, telling herself that exhaustion was making her imagine significance where none existed, though some small, persistent part of her was not entirely convinced by her own reasoning. Lying awake, later in the narrow bed her coin had finally secured, Linnet found herself turning the evening over in her mind, with a thoroughness she had not expected to apply to a chance encounter with a stranger she would likely never see again. There had been a moment, she now recalled, when one of the other travelers in the common room had gone suddenly quiet upon noticing Hollis at her table, his expression shifting into something that looked remarkably like recognition quickly suppressed, as though he had glimpsed something he understood he was not meant to acknowledge openly. She had thought nothing of it at the time, too absorbed in her own conversation to register the reaction as anything more than the idle curiosity travelers often showed toward one another. She thought, too, of the way Hollis had answered her questions about himself. Not with falsehood exactly, for he had never claimed to be anything in particular, but with a careful vagueness that she now recognized, in the clarity of hindsight, as deliberate omission rather than simple reticence. He had told her his work kept him traveling, that he answered to men whose orders he did not always agree with, but executed regardless. And she had assumed, without much thought, that this described the life of an estate steward or a man of business. Now, replaying his words against the memory of the innkeeper's strange deference, she began to wonder whether she had assumed wrong. She told herself, finally, as sleep began to claim her despite her racing thoughts, that it scarcely mattered who Hollis truly was, since she would be gone by midday, and their paths were unlikely to cross again in a world as vast and indifferent as the one she lived in. It was a comforting thought, and entirely wrong, though she had no way of knowing that yet as she drifted into a sleep deeper and more peaceful than she had managed in weeks. The morning arrived clear and bright, the storm having exhausted itself some time before dawn, and Linnet found Hollis already awake when she came down to settle her account, seated near the window with the quiet stillness of a man accustomed to early hours. There was an unspoken awkwardness to the morning that had not existed the night before. The particular discomfort of two people who had shared more honesty than circumstance, usually permitted between strangers, now faced with the practical business of departure, and the unspoken question of whether anything more would come of it. Hollis offered to see her trunk loaded onto the coach himself, an offer she accepted with a gratitude that surprised her in its intensity. And as they stood together in the inn's small courtyard, waiting for the driver to finish securing the last of the luggage, neither of them quite managed to say what seemed to want saying. He told her finally that he hoped her father's health would improve, and that he hoped, too, that she would someday find the recognition she had spoken of the night before, the sense of being seen for something beyond her usefulness to others. Linnet thanked him, and meant it, and found herself wishing, against all practical sense, that she had asked for some way to find him again, should circumstances ever bring her back through this part of the country. But she did not ask, telling herself that such a request would be improper between strangers who had shared a meal and nothing more. And Hollis did not offer, telling himself something similar, though his reasons were considerably more complicated than hers. As the coach pulled away down the muddy road, Linnet looked back once and saw him still standing in the courtyard, watching until the bend in the road took him from her sight. And she told herself, with more conviction than she actually felt, that she would forget him within the week. She did not yet know how thoroughly she would be proven wrong, nor how soon. 3 months passed before the letter arrived, bearing a seal that made Linnet's aunt go pale upon receiving it from the postboy, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the heavy paper over to examine the wax more closely. It was an invitation, formally worded and impeccably addressed, summoning the Marsh family to a reception being held at the county's principal estate in honor of a military commander recently returned from a campaign in the north, a man whose name Linnet did not recognize, but whose presence, according to her aunt's hushed explanation, was considered an honor few families in the district had ever been afforded. Linnet's first instinct was to decline, citing her father's continued frailty and the impropriety of attending such grand affairs while the family's finances remained so precarious. But her aunt would not hear of refusal, insisting that such invitations were not extended twice, and that the family's standing in the county might depend on their gracious acceptance. There was, too, a practical consideration her aunt did not bother to disguise. A reception of such magnitude would draw eligible gentlemen from across the county, and Linnet's prospects, however dim they currently appeared, might yet be salvaged by a single fortunate introduction made under sufficiently impressive circumstances. Linnet agreed, reluctantly, more to satisfy her aunt's evident anxiety than from any genuine enthusiasm of her own. and spent the following days being fitted for a gown she could not properly afford, her mind only occasionally drifting back to a rain-soaked evening at a roadside inn and a quiet man named Hollis, whose face had begun, despite her best efforts, to surface in her thoughts at inconvenient moments. She told herself the reception would be unremarkable, one more evening of polite conversation with strangers who would forget her by morning, exactly as she had told herself the inn would be forgettable. She had been wrong about that once already. She was about to discover just how wrong she had been. She told herself the reception would be unremarkable. She had no idea that the man waiting at the front of that receiving line was about to make every careful lie she'd told herself collapse in a single instant, and that nothing about the evening ahead would let her look away either. The estate was lit from end to end when the Marsh carriage finally pulled through the gates, candlelight spilling from every window onto ground still damp from an afternoon shower. And Linnet felt her aunt's grip tighten on her arm as they approached the entrance, equal parts excitement and nerves radiating from the older woman with every step. The receiving line stretched longer than Linnet had anticipated, a procession of county families waiting their turn to be presented to the guest of honor, and she found herself rehearsing polite phrases under her breath, certain the evening would pass in a blur of names she would not remember and faces she would not recognize again. Nothing prepared her for the moment she finally reached the front of the line and looked up to find Hollis standing there. Except he was not Hollis any longer, not in any way she could reconcile with the man who had shared bread and confession with her at a rain-soaked table 3 months before. He stood in a uniform heavy with insignia she did not fully understand but recognized instantly as significant. His bearing unchanged in its quiet authority, but now framed by every outward sign of the rank she had failed to perceive in him at the inn. The room around her seemed to recede into a dull hum as their eyes met, and she watched something flicker across his composed face. Not surprise, she realized with a slow and sickening clarity, but the particular stillness of a man who had known this moment was coming and had not decided how to navigate it. Her aunt, oblivious to the silent collision occurring directly in front of her, began the formal introduction with evident pride, presenting Linnet to General Hollis Brandt in a voice pitched for the benefit of everyone within earshot, and Linnet heard the title land like a physical blow, the careful arithmetic of the evening rearranging itself instantly in her mind. He had not lied to her, not technically, not with any single sentence she could point to and call false, but he had let her believe. And she had built an entire memory of intimacy on a foundation she now understood to have been incomplete in ways that felt, in this candlelit room full of watching strangers, very much like deception. He found her later, near the edge of the terrace where the music from the ballroom thinned into the cooler air of the garden. And Linnet did not pretend not to have seen him approach, though she kept her gaze fixed on the dark shapes of the hedgerows, rather than turning to face him directly. Hollis began without preamble, explaining that he had traveled that night under no name and no rank deliberately, as he had done on several occasions before, weary of conversations that began and ended with deference to his position, rather than any genuine exchange between two people. He told her that he had not set out to deceive her specifically, that the omission had simply continued because stopping it, admitting the truth partway through their conversation, had felt at the time like it would shatter something he had not realized he valued until it was already forming. Linnet listened to the explanation without interrupting, turning it over with the same careful attention she had once given his questions at the inn, and found that she believed every word of it, which made her anger considerably harder to sustain than she might have preferred. It was not, she told him finally, that she thought he had set a trap for her, luring her into confession with calculated cruelty. It was that she had told him things she had told no one else, had handed him a version of herself stripped of every protective layer she normally maintained, and had done so believing the exchange was equal. Two strangers, equally unknown to each other, equally vulnerable in their honesty. She told him, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest, that discovering his rank did not frighten her, but discovering the imbalance retroactively did. The realization that while she had been laying herself bare to a man she believed as ordinary as herself, he had been listening to her from behind the considerable shelter of a rank and reputation she knew nothing about. Hollis absorbed this without argument, recognizing, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, the particular unfairness of what he had allowed to happen, however unintentionally it had begun. Before we continue, if you are already feeling everything Linnet is feeling right now, hit subscribe. This story still has its hardest turn ahead, and its most satisfying one. It did not take long for the story to spread through the assembled guests in the particular way such stories always traveled through small county societies, transforming in the retelling until the simple fact of the General and Miss Marsh having spoken privately on the terrace became, by the time it reached the far end of the ballroom, something considerably more scandalous than the truth could support. Whispers followed Linnet for the remainder of the evening, not openly hostile but laced with the kind of speculative curiosity that made her acutely conscious of every glance directed her way, every fan raised to conceal a murmured comment she was clearly not meant to overhear. Miss Petra Calden, whose daughter had been positioned all evening as the most promising candidate for the General's attention, made her opinion known with considerably less subtlety than the other guests managed, remarking within Linnet's hearing that it seemed remarkable, did it not? How quickly some young women learned to attach themselves to men of consequence, as though acquaintance formed at a roadside inn carried the same significance as a proper introduction conducted under respectable supervision. The comment was calculated to wound, and it found its mark more thoroughly than Linnet cared to admit, even to herself, striking at the very insecurity she had confessed to Hollis that rainy evening, the fear that she would always be perceived as scheming for advantage rather than simply existing as herself. Linnet's aunt, alarmed by the direction the gossip had taken, urged a swift departure before the evening concluded properly, anxious that prolonged exposure to such speculation might do lasting damage to whatever marriage prospects remained available to her niece. Linnet agreed without protest, suddenly exhausted by an evening that had begun with hope and curdled, within a few short hours, into something considerably more painful. And as the carriage pulled away from the brightly lit estate, she found herself wondering whether she would have spoken so freely at that inn table had she known, even for a moment, who she was truly confessing herself to. Captain Osric Dell approached Linnet 3 days later, ostensibly to deliver a message from a mutual acquaintance, but in fact, as became swiftly apparent, to probe for details about her connection to General Brandt, that he could carry back to officers eager for any morsel of gossip that might diminish a commander whose recent successes had made him several rivals within the military hierarchy. Dell's questions were phrased with deceptive casualness, but Linnet recognized the pattern quickly enough, having endured a lifetime of relatives and acquaintances who asked questions designed to extract rather than to genuinely understand. She gave him nothing of substance, deflecting his inquiries with a politeness that revealed no more than the bare facts already known to half the county, and watched his expression shift from calculated charm to thinly veiled frustration as he realized she would not be so easily used as a source of ammunition against a man whose position he evidently coveted for himself. Dell, undeterred, attempted a different approach before departing, suggesting with feigned sympathy that surely she must resent the General for the embarrassment his deception had caused her, that surely a woman of her evident good sense recognized she had been made a fool of for his private amusement. The suggestion lodged itself in her mind more persistently than she wished to admit, not because she believed Dell's characterization to be accurate, but because it articulated a fear she had been wrestling with privately since the reception, the possibility that she had mistaken genuine connection for something considerably more one-sided, that her confession had mattered enormously to her, and scarcely at all to him. She did not yet know that General Brandt had spent every day since the reception attempting to find an appropriate way to prove otherwise, hampered by duties he could not simply abandon, and a woman who, understandably, was not eager to grant him the opportunity. When General Brandt's letter arrived requesting permission to call upon her, Linnet read it 3 times before deciding how to respond, weighing her genuine desire to understand him better against the very real fear of being made a further spectacle should the county discover a courtship developing between them. She was not afraid, she told herself firmly, of being seen as foolish for having trusted a stranger with her confession. She was afraid of confirming, through continued association, the very narrative Calden and her allies had already begun constructing, that she was a woman scheming her way toward consequence she had not earned through proper introduction. Her response, when she finally composed it, was polite but firm, declining his request for the present, citing her father's continued ill health and the family's need for quiet rather than further occasions for county speculation. It was not entirely untrue, though both of them likely understood it functioned as much as a boundary as an excuse, a way of telling him that trust, once disrupted, did not simply resume on his timetable regardless of his rank or his evident sincerity. She told herself, in the days that followed, that the matter was settled, that she had protected herself appropriately from further hurt and further gossip, and that General Brandt would, in time, redirect his attentions toward a woman whose connections came with fewer complications attached. But there was a particular ache in deciding this, a grief she had not expected to feel over the ending of something that had, after all, begun with a single shared meal and a confession she had not meant to make. She did not yet know that distance, for a man like Hollis Brandt, was not something he intended to accept quietly, nor that her closed door would prompt from him not retreat, but the first genuinely deliberate action he had taken in this entire matter. The opportunity General Brandt had been waiting for arrived in an unlikely form. A dispute among several tenant farmers on land adjoining the Marsh family's diminished holdings, a dispute that had escalated to the point where the local magistrate, overwhelmed and underqualified, requested the general's intervention given his standing and his reputation for fairness. It was, on its surface, entirely unconnected to Linnet, a matter of boundary lines and grazing rights that any number of officials might have resolved. But Brandt recognized, upon reviewing the particulars, that the dispute touched directly upon the rents Linnet had once described struggling to collect, the very tenants whose stubbornness had brought her to that rain-soaked inn in the first place. He resolved the matter publicly, at a gathering convened in the village hall with half the county present to witness it, and did so in a manner that left no ambiguity about where his sympathies lay. Siding firmly with the smaller landholders, the Marsh family included, against the more powerful neighboring estate that had been quietly encroaching on disputed boundaries for years, while no one with sufficient authority cared to intervene. He made no mention of Linnet by name, offered no public declaration that might have embarrassed her further, but anyone paying attention understood precisely whose interests had just been protected, and at what minor political cost to a man who had, in doing so, made an enemy of a more influential family. Word of the resolution reached Linnet within hours, carried by her aunt with an expression caught between relief and bewilderment, unable to understand why a man of such consequence would trouble himself with a dispute so far beneath his usual concerns. Linnet understood immediately, even as she told herself she should not read too much into it, that this was not the action of a man retreating gracefully from an inconvenient attachment. It was the action of a man attempting, in the only language available to him, that would not further compromise her reputation, to show her that her family's well-being mattered to him, regardless of whether she ever spoke to him again. She told herself the matter was settled. That distance had protected her, that a general like Hollis Brandt would simply move on. She was wrong. What he did next, he did in front of the entire county, and he never once said her name. The gesture repeated itself in smaller ways over the following weeks, each one careful never to draw direct attention to Linnet, never to create the appearance of courtship that might fuel further gossip, but each one unmistakable to anyone who understood what to look for. A physician of considerable reputation, normally engaged exclusively by families of significant means, arrived unannounced to examine her father, his fees already settled by an anonymous benefactor whose identity required no real investigation to determine. A shipment of correspondence finally arrived from her brother in the colonies, the silence explained at last by lost post rather than abandonment, a mystery solved with suspicious efficiency by a man with connections to the colonial administration that few private citizens possessed. Linnet recognized the pattern for what it was, a courtship conducted entirely through service rather than sentiment, through demonstrated care rather than declared affection, precisely because Brandt understood that words alone would not repair what his omission had damaged. He was not trying to convince her of his feelings through eloquent argument. He was attempting to show her, through consistent and unglamorous action, that the man who had listened to her confession at that inn table had not been a performance assumed for one evening and then discarded along with his disguise. She found herself, despite every resolution she had made to maintain her distance, watching for the next quiet evidence of his attention, and found, too, a grudging admiration forming alongside her lingering hurt. An acknowledgement that a man genuinely indifferent to the damage he had caused would not have troubled himself with her father's health or her brother's silence, would have simply moved on to easier company and let her anger fade into irrelevance over time. This was not that. This was something considerably more deliberate and considerably harder to continue resisting. Linnet finally summoned him herself, sending a note requesting that General Brandt call upon her at her aunt's house the following afternoon, a reversal that surprised her aunt considerably more than it surprised Brandt, who arrived precisely on time and waited, standing, until she gestured for him to sit. She did not waste time on pleasantries, telling him directly that she had noticed everything he had done in recent weeks, that she understood the intention behind each gesture, and that gratitude for his kindness toward her family did not automatically translate into restored trust between the two of them as individuals. She demanded, then, the explanation she had not properly extracted from him on that terrace months before. Not why he had concealed his identity that first night, which he had already addressed, but why he had continued the concealment for as long as he had, once the conversation deepened into something neither of them could mistake for ordinary small talk. Brandt answered without deflection this time, admitting that fear, more than calculation, had governed his silence. Fear that revealing his rank in that moment would transform her honest confession into something performed for his benefit, would make her retreat into the careful deference most people offered him, and that he had wanted, selfishly perhaps, to remain simply Hollis for just one evening before duty reasserted its claim on him. Linnet absorbed this admission in silence, recognizing in it an honesty that matched her own confession at the inn, a vulnerability offered without the protective armor he typically wore as naturally as his uniform. She told him, finally, that she believed him, but that belief alone was not sufficient to undo the damage of having discovered the imbalance after the fact rather than during. If he wanted her trust restored in full, she said, it would require more than explanation. It would require him proving, publicly and without ambiguity, that he valued her for exactly the reasons she had feared no one ever would. The path back to trust did not resolve itself in a single conversation, however honest. And both Linnet and Brandt seemed to understand this without needing to say it explicitly. He began calling on her openly rather than through quiet gestures conducted at a careful distance, accepting the risk of renewed gossip rather than continuing to hide his intentions behind anonymous kindnesses. A shift Linnet recognized as significant precisely because it cost him something real in terms of his public reputation and the scrutiny of rivals like Captain Dell, who would seize on any perceived vulnerability. Their conversations, when they resumed, carried a different quality than that first night at the inn. Less the unguarded ease of strangers with nothing to lose, more the careful, deliberate honesty of two people rebuilding something on more solid ground than coincidence had originally provided. Linnet tested him in small ways she did not fully acknowledge even to herself, watching for the moments when his old habits of careful omission might resurface, and found, gradually, that he met her scrutiny without flinching, answering questions she had not even asked aloud with a directness that suggested he understood exactly what was being evaluated. It was not a single grand gesture that finally convinced her, but the accumulation of many small, honest ones, each placed deliberately atop the last-like stones forming a bridge across water that had once seemed impossibly wide. She found herself, one evening in her aunt's modest garden, admitting to him that she had forgiven him, not because he had earned automatic absolution through rank or persistence, but because he had done the considerably harder work of earning it through consistent, demonstrated change, exactly as she had once told him, without knowing she was describing her own deepest hope. That forgiveness worth having was never simply given. The county's harvest assembly provided the occasion Brandt had been waiting for. The same grand hall that had once witnessed Linnet's quiet humiliation now arranged to witness something considerably different. He requested, this time through entirely proper channels, and with his rank fully and deliberately visible, the honor of escorting Miss Linnet Marsh, an arrangement that sent a ripple of recalculation through every family present who had previously dismissed her as inconsequential to the General's interests. He did not simply escort her quietly into a corner to avoid further scrutiny, as the more cautious approach might have suggested. Instead, he introduced her himself to several officers and dignitaries whose good opinion mattered considerably to his own career, speaking of her not as an afterthought, but with a directness that made clear precisely how he valued her judgment, her resilience, and the honesty that had first drawn him to her at a roadside table months before. Babars. Kelden, watching from across the room with an expression she could not quite arrange into appropriate neutrality, found herself with nothing further to say. Captain Dell, stationed near the refreshment table with the officers he had hoped to impress at Brandt's expense, offered no comment either. His earlier insinuations about the General's character rendered absurd by the plain devotion now on display before the entire county. Linnet stood through the introductions with a composure that surprised even herself. No longer the young woman who had once believed she would only ever be useful rather than valued, but someone who understood, finally and completely, that the man beside her had chosen to make his regard for her a matter of public record rather than private convenience. The same room that had once made her feel exposed and diminished now witnessed something she had genuinely stopped believing she would ever experience. Recognition offered freely, without calculation, before witnesses who could not pretend not to have seen it. Their wedding, when it came the following spring, was a considerably quieter affair than the county's gossips might have anticipated, given the drama that had preceded it, held in the small chapel near her father's estate, rather than the grand cathedral that Brandt's rank might easily have commanded. Linnet had requested the simplicity herself, and he had agreed without hesitation, understanding by now that grand gestures had never been what mattered most between them, that the truest moments of their courtship had unfolded across a humble table and a quiet garden rather than any ballroom however brightly lit. Her father, his health improved enough to attend, though still requiring assistance to stand, watched the ceremony with an expression of quiet satisfaction that Linnet would treasure for the rest of her life. And her brother, returned at last from the colonies, stood as witness to a happiness none of them had dared to hope for during the difficult months that preceded it. As Brandt spoke his vows, he did so without rank or title attached to his name, introducing himself one final time simply as Hollis, a small private joke between them that only the two people standing at the altar fully understood. What Linnet had learned, in the months between that rain-soaked confession and this quiet chapel, was that being truly seen required more than honesty offered in a single unguarded moment. It required honesty sustained, tested, and proven through ordinary action over time, the kind that did not announce itself with grand declarations, but built itself patiently, stone by stone, until it could bear the weight of an entire shared life. She had spoken freely to a stranger because she had nothing left to protect, and no expectation of being truly heard. She had stayed, in the end, because a general had shown her, again and again, that being heard had never been the limit of what she deserved. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments. What moment got you the most? Linnet's confession at the table, or the general who finally proved he was listening? And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because the next one is already waiting for you.